What's up, guys, and welcome back to another episode of Keeping Up with the Commanders. I'm Mason Kenahan alongside Calvin Kaplan, and I'm just going to say it right now. We just witnessed the best game of football the Commanders have played in the Keeping Up with the Commanders era. I mean, since this podcast came out, this is by far the best game that the Commanders played, and by far, I would say, the most entertaining game the Commanders have played in since this podcast came out right before the 2021 season. So, I mean, overall, let's get first thoughts here. Calvin, what do you have?
Well, the first thoughts are I haven't seen the Commanders put up 35 points in what seems like forever. It always seems like this team has been stuck in the 10s, the 20s. It never seemed like we could have those big blow up offensive games that other teams could. But I mean, ever since that touchdown drive and the 2-point conversion late in the second half, I mean, the offense just went off. Luckily for my fantasy team and for, of course, the Commanders, more importantly, Brian Robinson Jr. just had a massive game, really broke off a ton of big runs in the second half. But I mean, just the offensive performance was so impressive. A turnover-free game from Sam Howell. There's so much to get into. But yeah, I mean, 35-33 win in a shootout against the Broncos. Maybe it wasn't expected in this game, but it was fun to watch. That's for sure.
Yeah, and you mentioned it. We'll just start. We'll start right with it. Sam Howell, in his third start ever as an NFL starter, as an NFL player, third start in the regular season, he was very impressive today, and he's been impressive in both the Cardinals game and in the Broncos game as well this week. He's only had one extremely bad pass, which was the interception that was tipped. There's been a few dropped interceptions throughout both games, but overall tonight was definitely his better game of the two, and it came in a very each play that he put up big yards, a big throw. It all came in big moments, and that's just what you love to see. This team, this offense was down 21-3 early on, and yet Sam Howell, they didn't hesitate. They kept on attacking. Eric Bieniemy's play calling was aggressive, and it allowed Sam Howell to cast his talent onto the field, which we really saw. We saw it with he made some tough throws, the one to Terry, the one to John Bates down the sideline. Overall, it was just a beautiful night from Sam Howell. I would say it was his best start in the NFL so far.
Yeah, I would agree with that, especially considering, I mean, he's going up against a team where it really means something. They really, really need that bounce back game. And he got beaten up a lot early. And it wasn't entirely on the offensive line, which I thought, all in all, ended up playing a solid game outside of the first quarter. There were some times where Sam Howell was holding onto the ball too long. I even thought there were some times where he wasn't relying on his legs enough, which is something you don't often say about mobile QBs. But later in the game, he showed more of a willingness to run and really was getting more mobile, escaping sacks, and just making incredible throws time after time. Didn't really make any mistakes at all in that second half in terms of turnover-worthy plays. Obviously, the holding on to the ball in the backfield, maybe something to work on from this game. But other than that, I feel like it was really, really solid from Sam Howell and a really encouraging week 2 performance.
Yeah, you mentioned holding on to the ball too long has been one of his common trends, one of his common weaknesses throughout the preseason and into the regular season so far, which, again, that was really probably his biggest weakness tonight. And again, it wasn't bad enough so where they couldn't win the game. So they couldn't have an opportunity to win the game. He took some bad sacks in this game, but then again, he came up with some big throws. Like the touchdown to Terry, the big gain to John Bates on the right sideline. And again, also he was scrambling when he needed to and extending these plays. There was a few third downs that he picked up on his leg. He was making some tacklers miss in the open field, which was pretty amazing to see because we haven't really. I know Taylor Heinicke was somewhat mobile, but we haven't really seen a guy with Sam Howell's athleticism in Washington for a very long time. So overall, a great night from Howell. Anything else you want to say about him?
Yeah, I think that's pretty much it for me. It was just really, really solid, high completion percentage. He really played a better second half than he did the first. And I think the stats in the first looked solid, but I thought at times he, again, was holding on to the ball too long, didn't have a ton of pocket presence, but really adjusted after halftime, looked fantastic in the second half.
Yeah, his stats overall, he took 4 sacks, but beyond that, 27 of 39, 299 yards, 2 touchdowns, and a 108.8 passer rating.
And no
So,
turnovers. That was massive.
and no turnovers. So, again, we saw it. He turned it over in the Cardinals game twice, and then in the preseason, he turned it over a few times as well. So, this game, I want to say it was his first no, maybe it was his second clean slate game if you include the preseason. I want to say I think there was one preseason appearance. I think it was the Ravens game where he didn't have any turnovers, but overall, it was a very, very impressive performance from Sam Howell, and a lot of the country was watching him too, because you had the Cowboys Jets game end in a pretty big blowout, and they switch over to the Washington game, and everyone's watching. He puts on a show. You love to see it, but and then this offense overall. We talked about the offensive line a little bit. It was solid, especially towards the second half of the game. In the second half of the game, it was really solid at the beginning, 2 holding penalties. There was a false start, some miscommunication. But again, I really think Eric Bieniemy is one of the best in-game adjusting coordinators in the NFL right now, and I don't think it's close.
Yeah, I agree. And I think what was really huge is the willingness to spread the ball around in this game. Looking at the stats in this one, the Commanders had 9 different guys with 2 or more catches, which is just crazy to me, and nobody with more than 5. Terry McLaurin, this was a struggle game for him in terms of he ended up putting up solid stats, especially because of that one laser that he got in the end zone through a double team for a touchdown. But Pat Surtain was playing a fantastic game on him. Only had 1 penalty called on him the whole game, I believe, which was a pass interference that probably shouldn't have been called. Allowed 1 big play in a double team, and other than that, really locks down McLaurin. So props to Sam Howell for looking to other guys. I remember in particular that shot down the sideline to John Bates on that vertical route, hitting him in front of the deep corner or the deep safety down on the sideline. That was a fantastic throw. And Howell started making a lot of those plays and really the smart plays most of the time.
Yeah, like you mentioned, 9 different receivers with multiple catches, 10 overall with a catch. You had Byron Pringle getting involved. You had De'Ami Brown, who had 3 catches in this game, which, again, didn't do that much if anything at all, I believe, in the game against the Cardinals. Comes in, and on all 3 targets, he catches passes, 3 catches for 25 yards, was picking up some good yardage on pretty much every single one of his catches. And, like, again, you had the entire offense getting involved. Antonio Gibson was out there in the receiving game. In terms of the rushing attack, if we want to get into that, Brian Robinson was a machine tonight. 18 carries for him, only 2 carries for Antonio Gibson, 2 for Howell. I think both of those were like scrambles. And then Curtis Samuel had 1, I believe, on a jet sweep, I want to say.
Yeah.
So, like, it was Brian Robinson's job in the backfield. And again, Antonio Gibson's fumble last week kind of put him in the doghouse in terms of rushing attack. We saw him in the receiving more than we did rushing, but overall, Brian Robinson, what are your thoughts on him?
Fantastic game, especially later in the game. I think this is probably something we're going to see a lot from him, where maybe he doesn't start off the game super well, but as the team keeps sticking with him later into games, he really maintains that physicality that he runs with throughout the game. And suddenly we saw him breaking off a couple of long runs, a couple of big screen passes, and suddenly those stats were just piling up. He was getting touchdowns, and in the second half, he really seemed just to have more fight than a lot of that Broncos defensive front, which did their job in the first half, maybe not so much later in the game. We saw some big runs from Brian Robinson that looked really what like the Commanders were hoping for, really ever since they drafted him. Very, very efficient overall. But yeah, I think he's going to be a lot for this team, and he's going to be a second half running back. And I think in the second half, much like a guy like Derrick Henry, although obviously not as talented, you could really, they're very comparable, at least in the sense that though later in the games when the defense really starts to wear down, that's when they shine.
Yep. I mean, 18 carries, 87 yards, 2 touchdowns. He averaged 4.8 yards per carry tonight, which is crazy. Overall, Washington averaged 5.3 yards per carry on the ground. So great game for them on the ground overall, 122 yards. And I forgot, like, Hal did have that one fumble, which was towards the beginning of the game. Right. I think it was on that one where pressure tried to get rid of it, but it was broken up. But overall, like we mentioned, the offense, it's this offense showed some promise tonight, and I'm excited for what is to come. You got Buffalo next week, Philadelphia the week after that. Some very good offenses that are going to put up a lot of points. Tonight, we saw Washington's offense put up 35, which was their highest most points since 2020, and most offensive points. I know that 2020 game against Dallas on Thanksgiving was because of a defensive touchdown, which is why they put up 35. So it's their most points in a long time. Hopefully they can keep it up, because they're going to need to keep it up, unless this defense, though, we want to get into, keeps on playing like they're playing, because this defense is special too. What are your thoughts on them?
Yeah, they were fantastic. And I mean, first, I just wanted to briefly mention, like you said, this was a legit 35 game. This wasn't like a late touchdown that put the Commanders to 35. They put up 35 and held the lead. It was the most impressive offensive performance we've seen since that Thanksgiving game, or maybe even prior to then. But yeah, the defense overall, I felt like came out really, really lackluster in the first half, and maybe up until the Jamin Davis fumble that really changed things. But of course, the Broncos started off 3 drives, 3 touchdowns. The defensive line, I thought, was frustratingly bad on those drives, not even getting in the face of Russell Wilson slightly. Now, they picked it up tremendously in the second half, which was great. Again, the halftime adjustments for this team were fantastic in this one. We ended up seeing Payne get a sack, Montez Sweat got a sack and a half, Chase Young, Casey Toohill, James Smith-Williams. The team ended up having 7 sacks, but in the first half, I mean, they really were just all getting piled up later in the game, and suddenly Russell Wilson was taking all those shots. But I thought, especially then and in the run game, it was tough for the Commanders to stop the Broncos early on. Of course, we know how great of a tackle breaker Javonte Williams is. He is a ton to try to stop inside, so I don't necessarily blame the line completely, but I felt like the Commanders were really just getting run all over all the way, like, till midway through the second quarter. I thought guys like in the cornerback, like Emmanuel Forbes, played a very, very solid game overall. Of course, we saw Forbes get burned on that one deep ball to Marvin Mims at one point, which was funny because I was actually at the game. I was at home watching the game with one of my friends, talking up Emmanuel Forbes, and my friend had been like, "Oh, he's a reach." And I was like, "No, he's had a good season." Next play, he gets toasted, but he did have, I mean, a really, really solid game overall, a couple pass breakups, and looked really, really good. Of course, the big interception as well. So I thought the defense was solid. It seemed like Cody Barton was getting beaten over the middle at times, but also he got to the quarterback and made some big tackles. So I liked how the defense looked.
Yeah, overall, again, like you said, the beginning, very, very disappointing. It was beyond disappointing, especially with the talent that we know this team has. So much draft capital spent on this defense year in and year out. The Forbes thing was tough to watch, him getting beat by Marvin Mims. But again, it really, in the second half, this defensive line especially, we saw it in the Cardinals game. It was a close one at the half, and this defensive line stepped up. Washington was able to hold on. Tonight, Washington did the same exact thing. We were down at the half. We were getting blown out in that first quarter. Overtime, Washington started to step up. Daron Payne, during that one drive, had a sack, tackle for loss, and a pass breakup, like a batted down ball on 3 straight plays to make the Broncos go 3 and out, which I think that drive right there really showed and really kind of boosted this defense, and especially this defensive line, to push them towards the end, because I think that happened sometime in the third quarter, I believe, and it really pushed them towards the end, and kind of finish this game out and hold the Broncos to, which beyond that last Hail Mary, which was pretty disappointing, they held the Broncos defense in that second half to, Broncos offense in that second half to 12 total points and only 1 touchdown, which was on that Hail Mary. So overall, this Washington defense stepped up. They played to their potential. Cody Barton was the leading tackler, had 10. Cam Curl had 9. We talked about the sacks. Everyone was getting one. You had Daron Payne had 1. Montez Sweat had 1.5. Jamin Davis with 1. Chase Young with 1.5. Casey Toohill with 1. James Smith-Williams with 1. That's 6 different people with a sack tonight. That's crazy. I don't know when the last time that happened for Washington. Even with the talent on this defensive line, it shows the depth that this defensive line has, and it shows why they wanted to keep 10 players. We didn't see Andre Jones that much. We didn't see KJ Henry at all. He was inactive, but like still guys like Casey Toohill and James Smith-Williams making plays. Again, this defensive line still without Efe Obada and Fedarian Mathis as well.
Yeah, and I liked especially how Chase Young bounced back later in the game. Of course, getting his first sack in almost 2 years, then got another half sack along with, I believe it was Payne, where they both, or maybe it was Sweat.
It was Sweat.
It was Sweat, where they both got to the QB at the same time. Each got the half sack. I mean, he ended up playing, I think, want to say it seemed like he was playing more snaps than he was originally. I don't know if they specified a number that he was limited to, but he ended up staying out on the field a lot, really got to the QB. I felt like he was, as he tends to do, relying a lot on that speed rush around the edge rather than making like finesse moves, or, I mean, things along those lines. But at the end of the day, like his quickness around the tackles and just ability to chase down quarterbacks was, fantastic. This in the second half to have all four of the guys on that defensive line clicking on all cylinders was huge, because even when the Broncos were having big drives, Wilson was still getting knocked down. He was still getting sacked. And he just had guys in his face all the time in that second half. And it really looked like it made the Broncos offensive line look like how we expected the Commanders' to look. Meanwhile, the Commanders' offensive line really, really held up for a lot of that second half. Sam Howell certainly got hit, but there was some sort of fire that was lit into this team in the locker room. Something happened. The best halftime speech ever, because everybody was playing better in the second half.
Yep. And again, this Broncos offensive line, they're not the worst. They're not by means like near the top, but they're not the worst. They have some pieces on it that can be good at times, like Ben Powers, and say what you want about Mike McGlinchey, but he can be good at times. But like seeing this defensive line like show its true potential and how much havoc it can bring to an offense and how much it can just stall an offense just out of nowhere is exciting to watch, because again, you're going to be going up against some tougher opponents offensively. You got the Bills next week in that offensive line, and then you have one of the best offensive lines in the league. And then you got the Eagles the week after that, and they have one of the best offensive lines in the league. So it's going to be key for all four of these guys to stay healthy. I know we saw Daron Payne go down. He came back in and was still making a big impact once he came back in. But we'll have to keep an eye on that. And soon you're going to be getting guys like F.A. Obata back and Fidel Mathis to help with the run game. Or the run defense. So it's going to be exciting to watch. In terms of the secondary, we haven't talked about this yet, but Forbes had his first interception in the NFL. He put Russell Wilson on the Forbes list now, the first person on the Forbes list. So what are your thoughts on Emmanuel Forbes' performance? I know we talked about him a little bit, but overall, in my opinion, it was kind of a roller coaster.
Yeah, but it was, I think, good overall, obviously forcing the turnover, being heavily involved, and we didn't see him getting burnt a ton. Like, I think the main one was really the Mims play, and obviously the Broncos wide receivers did end up having some solid games, especially Cortland Sutton, Brandon Johnson, although most of his yards came on that stupid last Hail Mary. Overall, like Forbes, I thought had a really good game, and the secondary as well. Again, we could have had another turnover too, but Derek Forrest ended up dropping a really easy interception, but he did track that ball really, really well. So, this team is again putting themselves in position to make plays. One thing I think that has been consistent over the first two games is that ability to force turnovers, because we've seen multiple dropped interceptions. This team could have more turnovers forced than they do, and they're still making plays and getting the ball back for the offense. Like, of course, we had the fumble as well, so multiple turnovers again in this game, and yet it could have been even more than it already was. I think that's something new that we're seeing, because Commanders tended to rank closer to the bottom of the league in turnovers last couple of seasons, and now suddenly these takeaways are rising.
Yep. And you talked about Emmanuel Forbes on a different episode coming into the season. You were saying how him and the amount of turnovers that he can create, that's why Washington drafted him. It's for moments like this in close games where they need a turnover to either seal something or to have a better probability of winning the game. It's a moment like this where Emmanuel Forbes, I know it was miscommunication with Russell Wilson and his receiver on that play, but Forbes still came down with the interception. He was in the right place at the right time, which happened a lot back at Mississippi State. So it's going to be interesting to see how much he can rack up for the rest of the season. But a great start, one interception in 2 games is what you love to see. That pace is, all I'm going to say is that pace is on for like what, eight interceptions this season. So
yeah, 8 or 9 interceptions.
Yeah, 8 or 9 interceptions. So it's great to see. In terms of the other guys, Kendall Fuller, we didn't really hear his name that much, which is good if you're a cornerback. You don't really want to hear your name at all. Cam Curl was making a lot of tackles, especially some in the backfield. And then Percy Butler got some playing time as well. Derek Forrest got I think Derek Forrest, he had an up and down game, in my opinion. I believe it was some miscommunication on the deep Marvin Mims touchdown.
Yeah.
I think he was he like either he got burnt by it or something, but I have to look at it again. But he was involved with that touchdown, and whether it was miscommunication or something else. So it's going to these defensive backs, they weren't playing to their true potential. Like, they got better as the game went on, but again, at the beginning, this team needs to get off to better starts on both offense and defense, because we cannot be having that happen again. And when you're down 21-3 against the Bills, against the Eagles, it's going to be a lot harder to come back than against this Broncos team.
Yeah, absolutely. And on that Mims deep ball, I don't remember exactly who it was that got burnt, but I think you're right that it was Forrest, and it left Percy Butler chasing him down. Not that it wasn't Percy Butler's fault, but of course, that was really more on a deep post route. Then, of course, he went down the sideline. That is, I mean, classic Marvin Mims. All he really did at Oklahoma was run deep routes like that. But other than that, like you said, they got better as the game went on, allowed some big plays, allowing a lot of points at the end of the day, but it felt like this team after halftime really had a new fire in limiting the Broncos. And to be honest, obviously, like, you got to count that last second Hail Mary, but at the same time, you really don't. I see this team as having gone out there. They only allowed 2 field goals after halftime. Other than that, the defense looked really good overall. That last, play was just an absurd string of events. And of course, Cameron Curl trying to bat the ball away ended up tipping it straight up into the hands of Johnson. And outside of that, second half defense for the Commanders was great all around.
Yeah, great game from overall, great game from both the offensive and defensive side. But one side that I think we can both agree didn't have a great game across the entire time was the special teams, and especially that kicking unit, which we have to talk about. One of my favorite players on the Commanders, but for not a good reason. Cameron Cheeseman has been a problem throughout the preseason and during the Cardinals game, and now during the Broncos game here at long snapper. And when you trade up for a guy in the 6th round, when you trade up for a long snapper in the 6th round, they better be like generational. They better not mess up anything, which I know he was doing like testing out a new way of snapping the ball. It's not working. I don't know if he can go back to that old way he used to snap it, which I don't think he is, but it's like he got the yips or something. There was Joey Sly was 2 of 4 from field, 2 of 4 for field goals, and one of them was definitely on the snap. The other one was kind of a bad snap, but the first one was definitely a dribble. The low snap, it kind of just dribbled to Trustway. Trustway was somehow able to hold it for Joey Sly, but it kind of just messed up the whole system going on. So what are your thoughts on Cameron Cheeseman, and what do you think the plan should be moving forward with him?
Yeah, I think you said it all in terms of just that if you get a guy in the 6th round, if you're drafting a long snapper there, he better be really, really solid at what he does. And I mean, not to say that Cameron Cheeseman hadn't been in the past, but as of now, the preseason, now continuing into the regular season, it's become a problem. And I think that leash has to become shorter and shorter at this point. Obviously, that's like such a weird position because you don't necessarily have a free agent market of guys where you're just like, oh, I'm just confident that this guy will at least do his job. So let me release Cameron Cheeseman and pick up somebody else. So, I mean, obviously the Commanders is probably going to stick with him for the time being, but it was very concerning to say the least, especially early in the game. This didn't end up mattering with the comeback, but of course, you really want to start that game off up 3-0, get the ball first, get a scoring drive going, and a 49-yard field goal should be very makeable for Joey Sly. And if it wasn't for the snap, he very well could have hit it from 49 and gotten the Commanders the early lead.
And I know this is kind of a little bit of maybe a little bit of reach, but coming out of the half, second possession for Washington, getting the Emmanuel Forbes interception, you have a 59-yarder for Joey Sly, and I believe the snap wasn't great on that one. I know Sly missed it really badly, but imagine Washington makes that kick, then you're not worrying about a Hail Mary at the end and a possible 2-point conversion, which again, we should talk about that 2-point conversion a little bit. I think they got away with a DPI there.
Yeah, they did.
Yeah,
that's for sure. I would say they did. And like I mentioned, Terry McLaurin drew an undeserved pass interference on Pat Surtain. So 2 pretty key calls going in the favor of the Commanders, which happens. I'm sure if it was the other way, we'd be complaining about it right now. But yes, definitely a pass interference. Obviously, that doesn't necessarily mean he's coming down with the ball, or if they move it up to the 1 and they try again, maybe they're not getting in. Maybe the Commanders get the stop, or maybe they win in overtime. But obviously, while not like you changing the game, like they would have won or lost on that play, it still was a big one at the end of the game, and it was definitely a missed call.
Yeah, and I mean, I know a lot of Commanders fans are looking back to the Giants game last year. What happened to Curtis Samuel on, I believe, the 2-point conversion, or maybe it was 4th and goal, but when he was getting hugged by one of the Giants defensive backs. So it's kind of like a payback for the Commanders in terms of not getting that call called. But again, overall 35-33 win for Washington over a Denver team that now falls to 0-2 on the year. But
Mhm.
I will say this Denver team is better than it was last season.
Yeah,
Uh,
I think so. I think Russell Wilson had a good game overall considering what he had to face. Made a big mistake, obviously, in the throw to Emmanuel Forbes, like you said, a miscommunication. But he really ran the ball a lot. We
mhm.
saw a lot of vintage Russ. He was getting hit a ton and getting sacked a ton, which is also vintage Russ, you could say, because
Yep.
he's always been sacked a lot. But over 300 yards passing, 56 yards on the ground, played really solidly. I mean, this loss for Denver, you got to say, is on the defense because of how
Mhm.
effectively Washington was able to pick them apart. I think their secondary, it wasn't necessarily like, again, none of the Washington receivers were really torching these guys, obviously, because the Broncos had a ton of talent in the secondary, which they lost a little bit of after Kareem Jackson got ejected.
Yep.
So really, really talented secondary. I think that defensive line, linebackers, though, definitely allowing a lot of big plays over the middle, a lot of big rushing plays, and the Commanders won the battle.
Yeah, it was a close one, and
Mhm.
there was many times when Washington could have lost this game, whether
Yep.
it be just giving up after going down 18 points early on. But again, you bring in these new guys, Eric Bieniemy. I know Josh Harris didn't really have that much of impact on the game itself, but in terms of bringing in a new coach or the new owner, this team just feels different than it has been in the past. And winning this game, I don't know if the 2022 Washington Commanders would win this game. I don't think they would. The
Yeah.
2021 team would not win this game. So this team is definitely it's different. And now next week, if we want to preview it a little bit, they've got a tough opponent next week, and it's going to be their toughest so far on their calendar. It's the Buffalo Bills, a team that just blew out Las Vegas today, 38-10. Where you had Josh Allen throwing 31 of 37 with 275 yards and 3 touchdowns. So, what are your thoughts on this Bills team and heading into next week when they come to FedEx Field?
Yeah, it's going to be tough, and it's going to be a big matchup for Emmanuel Forbes against
Mm-hmm.
Stephon Diggs mainly. But number one is just, can this offensive line hold up the same way they did against the Broncos, at least in the second half? Because Sam Howell was getting hit a good amount, but maybe not quite as much as you would have expected. This coming week against the Bills, he might have to watch out. We could see a 5+ sack game, and
Yep.
it all depends. That I think that makes this flow of the game, it could really vary wildly. It could be one of those games where we just see a lot of 3rd and 7s that end in sacks, or one of those games where maybe the sacks come on 1st and 2nd down and Sam Howell steps back up, makes some big plays on 3rd downs and keeps drives moving. So I
Mm-hmm.
feel like we're going to either see some sort of shootout like we saw last week, or probably a Bills blowout. I don't think the Commanders are going to grind this one out and win 17-14. I know they
Yep.
kind of had that type of game against the Cardinals, but I don't think this team is that type of team again this year for the majority of games, especially against this Bills offense.
Yeah, this Bills offense is super talented. You had James Cook today, 17 carries for 123 yards. So, like, it's talented all around across the board. You had Gabe Davis being the leading receiver for Buffalo, not even Stephon Diggs. So, there's a lot of things Washington's defense will need to improve on. I know they had a solid game today against Denver, but they let up 33 points.
Mhm.
So, like that's not going to do well if you let up 33 points against the Buffalo Bills. Um, and one more thing here, like the tackling today wasn't the prettiest, I will say. Like there were some missed tackles where it could get ugly really fast if you miss those tackles against Buffalo. So the team and the secondary overall has to get better. The second level tackling has to get better. The linebackers, Cody Barton looked lost in that first quarter and a half or so. Jamin Davis was up and down throughout the night. Like there's definitely pieces on this defense that could be liabilities during this game against Buffalo, but overall, again, Buffalo's got Dalton Kincaid and Dawson Knox, two pretty solid tight ends. Dalton Kincaid being their first round pick this year. These linebackers will need to step up in coverage and just overall improve their play if Washington wants to win this game.
Yeah, that's a great point. And what the Commanders faced in week one, of course, was an aging Zach Ertz just coming off
Yeah.
of an injury, and he still got some involvement. And then Adam Troutman, obviously, who's not a top tight in this league, to face better tight ends who are pass catchers. Obviously, Dalton Kincaid and Adam Troutman Dalton Kincaid and Dawson Knox aren't stars, but this was a big weakness. I remember it felt like constant Eagles games where Dallas Goedert would just go off against Washington. They have had weaknesses against tight ends in the past. Like you said, this is a different team, but the linebackers will definitely need to step it up in coverage.
Yeah, and one last thing here. If Washington were to win this game, how would they do it?
How would they do it? Probably just by a shootout. I think it would have to be 300 plus yards from Sam Howell, probably 1 or 0 turnovers, ideally 0. Maybe we'll see more touchdowns through the air. I feel like really, really similarly to how they won this last game on offense. Of course, if they had converted on special teams early, the Commanders would have gotten at least some more early points, but I felt like the offense in the second half looked great. And I think the one thing that we could see in this game that we didn't see against the Broncos is maybe even more Terry McLaurin involvement, not just on like one big deep ball and then otherwise being quiet other than short passes, but on multiple big plays. I think we could see a big Terry McLaurin game next week.
I think you talk about the offense. On the defensive side, I think you have to keep Josh Allen in the pocket, but at the same time, you have to apply pressure on him. You can't let him sit in the pocket, wait for Gabe Davis to go 40 yards downfield and for him to let it rip, because these DBs will get burnt by Gabe Davis. Stephon Diggs will be open downfield. We saw it today. There was multiple chances where Russell Wilson could have hit Marvin Mims again downfield, or I think Cortland Sutton had a moment where he was wide open downfield, and except the pressure was there and Wilson couldn't see it downfield, and instead he got sacked or he had to take the check down instead. So this defensive line for Washington will need to apply pressure on Josh Allen, and at the same time, they have to keep him within the pocket, which is harder to say harder to do than it is to say. But it's going to be an interesting one. Hopefully, Washington will be able to pull out the W. But I will say, my confidence is not that high. This Buffalo team, I know they fell week 1, but again, their performance against Las Vegas, like their week 1 was kind of a fluke, just getting back into things.
Yeah. Also, we can't have dropped interceptions against Buffalo because Josh Allen will turn the ball over hopefully against the secondary, because he does turn it over a decent amount. But I mean, if you don't take advantage of those, there's really not much option for stopping the Bills.
Yep. All right. Well, that's going to do it for today's episode. Where can people find you and your content?
Yeah, I'm on Twitter at Calvin_SGF. And that's pretty much where I post about all my content. Glad to be back on the show and glad to see a big Commanders win.
Yeah, Washington Commanders 2-0 after the first 2 weeks of the season, first time since 2011. I was 5 years old. So great to see it. That'll do it for this week's episode of Keeping Up with the Commanders. See you guys next one. Peace.